Hey friends, welcome back for another chapter of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Today we are reading chapter number 10, and it's called The Family Begins to Starve. This does not sound like a happy chapter. But before we start reading, let's review what happened. In chapter 9, remember Grandpa Joe had a secret silver coin under his pillow, a 10-cent dime that he gave to Charlie and asked him to go to the nearest store and buy the first candy bar that he saw, and he brought it back and they opened it together. But unfortunately, this candy bar did not have the last golden ticket inside. So Charlie's had 2 chances now, but no golden ticket. Let's see what happens in this chapter. The family begins to starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw huge flakes drifting down slowly out of an icy sky that was the color of steel. Wow, imagine that in your brain. We know in Michigan in the wintertime, it's very, very cloudy and the skies are gray. In Charlie's town, the skies were the color of steel. By evening, it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping. And oh, how bitter cold it was. Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice, and each time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Woo! Think about how cold that is. It is so cold, it feels like someone is cutting your cheek with a knife, and it's just the cold wind blowing. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing in through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long since been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except for 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about the very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious warming dishes. And because we are all a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because his family couldn't afford it. And as the cold weather went on and on, he became ravenously and desperately hungry. Both bars of candy, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away. And all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then, all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was that the toothpaste factory, the place where Mr. Bucket worked, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he earned a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets, but it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everybody in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would have to pass Mr. Willy Wonka's giant chocolate factory. And every day as he came near it, he would lift his small pointed nose high in the air and sniff all the wonderful sweet smells of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on end, taking deep swallowing breaths as though he were trying to eat the smell itself. There's a picture of Charlie, little Charlie, standing out in front of the giant gates of the chocolate factory. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from underneath the blanket one icy morning. "That child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're We're too old to bother with. But a growing boy? He can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton. What can one do? Murmured Grandma Josephine miserably. He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate at breakfast this morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back. He's a fine little fellow, said Grandpa George. He deserves better than this. The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. The skin was drawn so tightly over his cheeks that you could see the shapes of his bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer like this without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with that curious wisdom that seems to come so often to small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did so as to save his strength. In the mornings, he left the house 10 minutes earlier so that he could walk slowly to school without ever having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during recess, resting himself, while others rushed outdoors and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then, one afternoon, walking back home with the icy wind in his face and incidentally feeling hungrier than he had ever felt before, his eye was caught suddenly by a piece of paper that was lying in the gutter, in the snow. The paper was a greenish color, and there was something vaguely familiar about it. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw at once what it was. It was a dollar bill. Quickly, he looked around. Had somebody just dropped it? No, that was impossible, because the way part of it was buried. Several people went hurrying past him on the sidewalk, their chins sunk deep down in the collars of their coats, their feet crunching in the snow. None of them was searching for any money. None of them was taking the slightest notice of the small boy crouching in the gutter. Then, was this his? This dollar? Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it out from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole dollar. He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him at that moment, only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving toward the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery store, the kind that sells almost everything, including candy and cigars. And what would he do? He whispered quickly to himself. He would buy one luscious bar of candy and eat it all up, every bit of it, right then and there. And the rest of the money he would take straight home and give to his mother. And that's the end of the chapter. Wow, that's interesting. Have you ever found any money laying on the ground outside? Sometimes I find a penny or a quarter on the ground. It's very rare to find paper money laying on the ground. But remember, Charlie's family is so poor that they don't have enough money to buy food at the grocery store. And Charlie just found $1. So he's gonna spend 10 cents to buy a candy bar for himself, and he's gonna bring 90 cents home and give it to his mom to buy food for the family. Wow, what would you do if you found that dollar? All right, we're gonna find out tomorrow in the next chapter that we read. Thanks for listening.